Welcome. I'm Kentucky State Representative George Brown, and I serve as the chair of the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus. As an affiliate of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, we welcome you to our annual commemoration of Bloody Sunday, the 1965 Selma March for Voting Rights.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we tried, bitter the chastening ride, fell in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat now our weary feet come to a place for which I find the sign.
It was a watershed event in the long struggle for voter rights, one that unfolded on television screens across the nation and left an indelible mark on American history. Today, it is remembered as Bloody Sunday for the brutal assault inflicted upon a group of peaceful demonstrators as they marched for racial justice and equal access to the ballot box. But we also remember the courage and moral determination of those who stood for justice in a time of ruthless adversity. The shocking events of March 7, 1965 would go on to cement the civil rights movement throughout the country and set the stage for landmark reforms. The 1965 Voter Rights Act only a few months later. That day in March is commemorated in Selma, Alabama, and across the nation each year to emphasize the struggle for voter rights. Kentucky joined the commemoration in the state capitol in Frankfort as a reminder that democracy strives when every eligible voter has a fair opportunity to vote and to fight against voter suppression. The event in 1965 started when hundreds of demonstrators gathered in Selma, preparing to embark on a multi-day 54-mile march to the Alabama Capitol in Montgomery. Several months earlier, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the legacy of Jim Crow continued to cast a long shadow over much of the South, especially in Dallas County, where voter registration among Black Americans remained exceedingly low and voter intimidation ran high. At the time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was ramping up efforts to increase registration among Black voters in the county seat of Selma. Only about 2% of the African American population was registered to vote there in 1964. But the efforts drew steep opposition from segregationist authorities who jailed thousands of demonstrators by February 1965. That same month, a 26-year-old African-American man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was fatally shot by a state trooper during a peaceful march for voting rights in a neighboring county. Amid the abuses, civil rights leaders, both local and national, called for a march on the state capitol, seeking to draw attention to the brutality and injustices that had resulted in Jackson's death. But efforts to thwart the movement were also growing more intense. Alabama Governor George Wallace condemned the planned demonstration as a public safety threat and ordered state troopers to prevent it through whatever means necessary. On the day of the march, around 600 demonstrators, led by future Congressman John Lewis, among others, left the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma and headed several blocks toward the Alabama River. As the group crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they squared off with a large contingent of law enforcement and local civilians who had been deputized that day by militant Sheriff Jim Clark.
Here, advance toward the group.
See that they disperse.
The violence that followed would appall the country and galvanize support for reforms. Police began assaulting the marchers with billy clubs and tear gas. Others rode through the crowd on horseback. One of the organizers, Amelia Boynton, was beaten unconscious, while John Lewis suffered a skull fracture. In all, more than 50 marchers were hospitalized with injuries from the assault. The bloodshed was documented by television crews and journalists covering the march and transmitted to millions of homes across America.
With nightsticks and tear gas.
It spurred outcry and demonstrations across the country and awakened many to join the fight for civil rights. Just days later, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced federal legislation that was destined to become the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a measure he signed into law that August.
We shall overcome.
And civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., organized 2 more marches from Selma in the ensuing weeks. The final march ended with 25,000 people demonstrating at the Alabama State Capitol on March 25th. That day, Dr. King delivered his now famous "How long, not long" speech on the Capitol steps.
I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long, not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long, not long. How long? Because you shall reap what you sow. Yes, sir. How long, not long. How long? Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, sir.
2 years ago, the Kentucky Selma Commemoration Coalition came together to reenact the events of Bloody Sunday and rally for voter participation at the Kentucky Capitol. The Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus was a key organizer and a driving force as hundreds of supporters marched from Main Street and down Capitol Avenue in solidarity with the Selma event, along with others commemorating the event around the nation. The marchers crossed the War Mothers Memorial Bridge and proceeded to the Capitol steps with Governor Andy Beshear and an original participant from the march in 1965 as a symbolic representation of the Selma events. In addition, panels and related commemorations coordinated their focus on voter rights across the Commonwealth. Rather than attacks and hostility, the group was welcomed by the Frankfort community. And while there was much change to celebrate, it was an important reminder about a dark period in our collective history. One recognizing that expanding the vote is as relevant today to ensure a vibrant and inclusive democracy. This year marks the 57th anniversary of the Selma March, and the legacy of that day informs our future just as much as our past. When we look back to that Sunday in 1965, we must ask ourselves, who among us would cross that bridge today? Who among us would stand for justice against such insurmountable odds? Because in Kentucky and across America, the struggle continues for a new generation, and many more bridges lay ahead.
Hello, my name is Kentucky State Senator Gerald Neal, and I'm speaking with you today because we are revisiting the commemoration, in fact, of the SELMA March of 1965. I have with me today some gentlemen that are very knowledgeable with respect to issues related to the subject matter of voter rights and voter suppression. And this panel that we have assembled here will enter into a discussion about these particular issues related to that subject matter. We have with us today here first, Dr. Joseph Grant. Dr. Joseph Grant, a PhD, is the Deputy Director of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, also known as NBCSL. And Dr. Grant has over 40 years of experience working in the governmental and legislative affairs arena. He has been involved in every significant piece of educational legislation to pass the South Carolina General Assembly from 1975 to 1993. Welcome, Dr. Grant.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Dr. Senator Neal.
We also have with us Anthony Daniels. Anthony Daniels is the esteemed member of the Alabama General Assembly. He is the House Minority Floor Leader, and he has been very much involved in the annual events related to the SELMA marches, the commemorative marches that are ongoing from year to year. Welcome, Anthony, Representative Daniels.
Thank you, Senator Neal.
In addition, we have Dr. Ricky L. Jones. Ricky L. Jones is chair of the Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville. He's well known, just not in the Louisville area and across Kentucky, but nationally in terms of his commentaries and the work that he produces with respect to issues that affect African Americans and other minorities. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
Welcome, Senator Neal. Thank you.
Thank you. And in addition, we have Dr. Anthony Everett, who is a representative of the Kentucky Conference of NAACP. He is also an executive of the Mission Behind Bars, a faith-based reentry program, and he's former vice chair of the Commission on Human Rights. I want to welcome you, Dr. Everett.
Thank you, Reverend Neal, Senator Neal. Sorry about that. I knew you all kind of time.
Yeah, we don't want to pull down the faith-based community by referring to me as Reverend. Let me say this. I am so delighted to have such distinguished panels of individuals. I've worked with some of you over the years, and I know your involvement with respect to that. And of course, Anthony Daniels and myself have a special relationship by virtue of what we do in representation of our constituency. So, we all lived through some part of SELMA, the 1965 effort at voter rights, which is known as iconically Bloody Sunday. But the reality is that we go way back before that. That's just an iconic view of a very important event. But historically, we've had a situation that really has always presented itself in this way. With you all's permission, I'm going to refer to you by your first names, and I would encourage that. Ricky, would you get into that sort of historical piece with respect to the struggle for vote?
Yeah, I think to try to do it quickly for sake of time, you really can't understand voter suppression until you understand how the vote has been structured in America, and that the franchise from the founding of the country was relatively restricted. And if you can't understand voting and politics in America, if you don't understand power, because in a democracy, voting is about power sharing. It's about decision making. You know, politics is the process that decides who gets what, when, where, and how. So at the founding of the country, the only people who could vote were property holding white males. And so then there was a struggle to spread the franchise out from there. No black person in the country could vote. When people talk about the 3/5 compromise, it wasn't that people were just saying that black people were 3/5 of human beings. Whites in the South wanted blacks to be counted fully, but they didn't want to allow them to vote. Very much like a lot of regions in the country right now want to use people who are incarcerated for redistricting and reapportionment, but they don't want to allow them to vote. So it's the same type of dynamic. You didn't have to worry about the black vote up until 1870. We have a weird period for 50 years in the country from 1870 to 1920, where by law, in a de jure way, black men have the right to vote, but no woman had the right to vote. But when you get into Reconstruction, you know, the end of the Civil War in 1865, those 3 Reconstruction Amendments are incredibly important. 13th, freeing the slaves, 14th, granting citizenship, 15th Amendment of 1870, giving black men the right to vote, again, by law. But immediately you start to see voter suppression movements. When you talk about grandfather clauses, poll taxes, intimidation, outright murder in this country, all of these things, these were voter suppression movements. So people ask, you know, what was really going on as we move forward all the way to the 60s and people struggling for voting rights? You know, by law, you could say that all black men had the right to vote from 1870. All black women had the right to vote from 1920. But there were de facto moves, traditional moves that were put into place and bled into politics to keep people from voting. So what the 65 Voting Rights Act did, it made it a federal offense to impinge upon this protected class's right to vote. You couldn't just do these things on a local level and then report to yourself, that being the state's examination of voter suppression movements. But unfortunately, what we've seen, and so much is still going on, the Supreme Court has in effect rendered the 65 Voting Rights Act, as one professor from Harvard said, is a little more than a dead letter. So you still have voter suppression going on. The last point that I'll make is this: there's always been a racial element to voter suppression in the United States. It's switched parties. When you talk about the 19th century, the Democrats were doing it because no blacks were Democrats. They simply were not going to vote for Democrats. So Democrats were working to suppress or kill that vote. Now you see Republicans doing it. It is a smart political move. It is inhumane. It is undemocratic, but it's a party that knows it's going to get little or no vote strength from the black community. So it behooves them to try to keep that constituency's voting strength as minimal as possible. So what's problematic is very much like, people in the great black church say the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing people that he didn't exist. And I think that's now where people try to convince you that voter suppression doesn't exist. And if voter suppression does exist, it's certainly not along lines of race. There is no real voter fraud in this country, but voter suppression is real, and it's about power sharing, and it's very much about race. So it's something that people need to pay attention to. Hopefully I didn't take too long to summarize that historically for you, Brother Neil.
No, in fact, I thought that was a beautiful framing of this and gives us the context and the background that we need. I'm going to switch over to Anthony Daniels because we have now the SELMA commemorative. There was a reason why we have a SELMA commemorative with the March in 1965 and its relationship to the Voter Rights Act 1965. So, Anthony, tell us what that is about. What was it about in Alabama, in Selma, Alabama, that's important about making this point about voting, voter rights, and now voter suppression?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Jones, Ricky, for that beautiful history lesson, and Senator Neal for the invitation, and all of the panelists that are here with us today. What happens in SELMA, which is why this important annual event is extremely important, is so that we're reminded of from whence we've come, and understanding that we are not that far from whence we've come. We're still experiencing voter suppression and a number of things through laws all across the country. And so this is an opportunity for children that are newborns all the way to someone that's, elderly in age, all to come together and be reminded of what it has taken for us to get to this point. Because oftentimes when when I was a third grade teacher, oftentimes our young people are not necessarily taught this aspect of history in our history books, and with CRT and all these other codes is going to further suppress this particular information from being out there. So it's important that we come together, members of Congress, state legislatures all across the state, across the country, as well as people from all over the world coming to really walk and march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and really reliving a rendition of what actually happened so that we never lose this part of history. And so it's a wonderful weekend. It actually started last night where Nobel Women and NBCSL and other organizations and members of Congress coming together to have a discussion and panel discussions all weekend about what happened, going to Brown Chapel and speaking and having prayer breakfasts and all of these things in Selma, Alabama, so that we don't allow this history to escape us, and that everyone will understand and appreciate what has happened, but also understand that there's a modern Selma, a Bloody Sunday that's going on through policy. And so it helps keep all of our people updated. But this is a wonderful weekend, a lot of activities, but it's just a reminder to really help educate us at all different levels. There are activities for children, there are activities for young adults, there are activities for those that are policymakers and those that are working on policy in general, and the average citizen in Alabama. And so we're educating people in all aspects, all levels, but also reminding them of where we are and how much further we have to go.
Well, you have to make note that the struggle that is reflected in what is being done as it relates to Selma and the commemorative and what the points that you just made has spread beyond the borders of Selma, but into other communities and other states such as Kentucky. And I'm delighted to say that in Kentucky, we heard that call, that message that you just gave, and we held a commemorative, and we had a symbolic crossing of a bridge up to our Capitol and made speeches to remind young people and older folks alike and the powers that be that we recognize that this struggle, or too much was invested in it, and that this is not going to be something that's going to be put down now, that we know that struggle still continues. And the NAACP, the Kentucky Conference of the NAACP, was one of the major organizing entities at that time. Anthony Everett, tell us more about what the NAACP's perspective is on this and its involvement in dealing with voter rights and dealing with voter suppression.
So I want to state that what Dr. Jones had mentioned earlier about the history and all is just so on point. And a part of that history has been the NAACP, and it continues to be part of that struggle. There have been voting rights acts all along the way, but there's been resistance on behalf, and that shows the resistance that's been taking place on behalf of African Americans and other people who have been disenfranchised by the vote. The NAACP in the state of Kentucky has teamed with the League of Women Voters, for instance, to address the redistricting problem here in Kentucky. And redistricting is another form of disenfranchisement that's taking place across the country. And so we've engaged with the League of Women Voters to address it and to also be actively resistant against it. At this point, it's been more in terms of reaching out to legislators such as yourself and others to go up against that. There's a bill that you have out right now that we have been supportive of. I think it's 223, 233, one of those two numbers. Yes. And so we've been engaged with that, and we're getting others to get involved as well. If you look across the country and you look in Georgia, for instance, you'll see that the NAACP and the ACLU have teamed up together. and they've actually sued the state of Georgia in regards to the redistricting that's taking place. I think that's a major problem that we're focused on right now. And it's not, when I say we as the NAACP, I'm also speaking about a number of other organizations that are engaged with this struggle as well. We realize the problem of disenfranchising people based on this redistricting of the maps. One of the things that Ricky Jones had pointed out a moment ago also was that, you know, they will take the count of people who are in prison and use that, you know, for representation, but those same people in Kentucky can't vote. And so I think that's very important to note, and that's part of what we're doing here in Kentucky.
Outstanding. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned Georgia that sued regarding redistricting.
Yes.
Well, also Kentucky has sued regarding, at least in terms of the House seats and the congressional seats.
Okay.
Relates to our plan of redistricting. So the struggle continues, as they say, or if you will.
Yes, sir.
Joe, let me from the standpoint of this particular piece, we keep getting the words resistance with respect to that. What is this resistance, and where is it being resisted across the United States? If you have that information, I would ask anybody else to chime in behind Joe with respect to that.
Well, Dr. Jones really makes the case that voter suppression and resistance to people of color having the right to vote has been going on for a long time. I tend to use some data from the Brennan Center for Justice that has done a fairly good job of tracking voter suppression legislation across the country. And they have identified states where there's been an onslaught of legislation introduced, pre-filed, or carried over from the previous legislative session to further suppress the right of people of color to vote. They report that there's been a 39% increase in voter suppression legislation introduced by states. That's 39% over last year. So they're counting 240 bills across 27 states whose sole purpose is to suppress the rights of people of color to vote. You know, that's really, really significant. And we can identify where that legislation is coming from. I mean, states primarily led by the Republican Party, where they fear losing control of their state. They are really going out of their way to create obstacles to people having the opportunity, people of color specifically, having the opportunity to vote. And finding ways to address that, which has been the challenge of members of NBCSL, you know, it's been challenging. Because we often don't have enough votes in the state legislature to do anything about it, which is why we are now focused on rekindling a federal effort to address the whole voter suppression question.
So what we're talking about is we're talking about voter suppression. And you mentioned a party at this particular historical moment. Ricky Jones mentioned that in the beginning, it was the Democrats. Right. No person of color, African Americans in particular, would have been a member of the Democratic Party in the history. And now we see a swing to the Republicans. So we got sort of a bipartisan problem here, at least in the historical framework. And so here we are today. So the question in my mind is, what are they, when I say they, those who are in power then and now, what is their major concern? What can you discern there? Anyone jump in on that?
Well, you can start with the big lie that former President Trump is still promoting. I think he really sort of serves as the model for what is happened within the Republican Party. This absolute fear of losing control, of not being able to direct public policy, is really what's driving this. It's the fight against giving up power, not being willing to concede power. And I mean, it's as plain as the nose in your face.
I would like to add to that. Yeah, and I would say that I think it's the browning and the darkening and the blackening of the United States of America that plays into all of this. And that, we're a country that has been based and founded on systemic racism. And systemic racism is a system. It continues on. It changes in different ways and forms. And I see this voter suppression. I see this disenfranchisement as being something that's a perpetual part of systemic racism. And so I think it comes back to this blackening and browning of the United States of America.
If I may intercede with that, when you use that term systemic racism, you get this pushback. There's no such thing as systemic racism, which defies any intelligent examination of reality. All things are a reaction to some form of a system, and certainly racism is imbued in this society from its inception. So I'm gonna go to Anthony Daniels just for a second, because I am interested in knowing what's happening in Alabama. What is happening in Alabama as it relates to this issue of voter suppression? And what's the reaction to it in terms of what you're doing and your those who are opposed to this suppression?
And before Mr. Daniels answers that, the Brennan Center is touting Alabama as being one of the states that is working to expand the opportunity for people of color to vote. Is that an accurate assessment as they're promoting it?
Well, by virtue of our efforts to really target rare and sporadic African Americans, which has been our primary focus in Madison County, which increased Joe Biden's performance 22,000 votes higher than the governor of Alabama in the presidential election. And so what you're beginning to see is many of my colleagues on the other side following the George Floyd. It was a bipartisan group put together that I led with the House of Representatives of Republicans that wanted to sit down and understand what they couldn't understand. And one of the conversations that we had, to Dr. Everett's point, and also Senator Neal's point of systemic racism, we talked about one of my colleagues owned a couple of subways, and he had an 815 credit assets where there no real liabilities or debt, and it took a person that had another franchise of subways to go to the bank and force that bank and say, I will take my money from you guys. This guy has the same credentials I have, has a higher credit score and better credit worthiness, but he cannot get access to capital. And so when using those particular examples, it forced the group to actually start listening. And so we started focusing on public policy that expanded voter access to voter engagement. We did the early voting, of course, because of the pandemic, but there are some efforts from individuals that's running for Secretary of State, one in particular in the House of Representatives, to keep organizations like the NAACP and others from doing voter registration drives. And so and then there's another bill to not allow, to prohibit individuals that are poll watchers from being able to help individuals that may ask a question inside of a precinct that needs assistance, to make that more of a misdemeanor. And so there are some efforts, but there are conversations beforehand, because I don't play games in the legislature. I will shut the entire legislature down as these particular bills come. There are certain issues that I'm willing to hold up the rest of the entire session. And so I use the nuclear option when fighting back. And one thing a white person don't like is that's being called racist, right? And so we have 27 members that are African-American that's in the Alabama House of Representatives, and 7 that's in the Senate. And so what we typically do is try to negotiate on the front end to either water down a bill in the House and get an agreement from the leadership in the Senate not to move it. And so we've been playing a lot of defense. I don't know about the expansion and the expansion of access. I don't necessarily now. The Secretary of State that we currently have, he focuses a lot on voter registration. However, he is allowing Donald Trump to do commercials and be the person to encourage people to register to vote in Alabama this year. And so in our eyes, we believe that is electioneering, right? And so there are things that are happening all across the board that we're playing defense. I don't necessarily think they're expanding access to voting opportunities. Now, we have put together a bipartisan group to address some of the access issues, but it's harder for those things to move through the legislature, especially during an election year.
But how incredible is that?
Yes.
Right? That what Brother Daniels is saying, and what Brother Grant says, from the Brennan Center's assessment, Alabama is more progressive on the expansion of voting rights along lines of race than many other areas in the country are right now. Sit with that for a second. If you understand, and I'm from Georgia, right? I'm a son of the South as well. My father lives in Birmingham, so I'm familiar with Alabama. Alabama is more progressive right now at this time than many other areas of the country in the expansion of voting rights. And so you ask something, and man, what a blessing it is this afternoon to be sitting with, some brothers who actually say what they mean rather than tiptoeing around these things, because you ask a question as to why this stuff is going on. 3 lessons I've learned, brothers. 1, a challenge unanswered is a challenge believed. So we have to answer all challenges. That's 1. 2, never allow anybody to tell your story if you alive and well and can tell it yourself. Okay.
Amen.
And 3, don't allow your opponents to define the terms of discourse around any issue where your people are concerned.
Amen.
And so when we talk about this stuff, and I think Brother Everett brought it up, Brother Grant brought it up, Brother Daniels was going there. You can't have a legitimate socio-political conversation about America and race without talking about white supremacy. You cannot do it. You can't have a legitimate conversation about it. What's driving all of this, what's always driven this, is white supremacy. And people get upset about that. And Brother Daniels is right. White people don't like when you call them racist, or what they'll do, they'll flip it and call you a racist as a Black person if you put these things on the table. Because when I'm talking about white supremacy, here's what I mean. And Brother Neil, I try to say this as often as I can. As an educator, people been talking about anti-CRT stuff. I'm like, look, this ain't about critical race theory when you all are trying to push this stuff, because 90% of you don't even know what the hell critical race theory is. When you really sit down and talk to them, they can't put a legitimate definition to it. They can't talk about a single scholar who said anything about it. They can't say where it's taught. They don't know anything about critical race theory. It's not about critical race theory. All right. What it's really about is the maintenance of white supremacy in education, which comes out of the same ideology that is trying to push voter suppression, that is trying to push unbalanced redistricting and reapportionment, that's trying to push everything that we see. It's coming out of the same bag. And when I talk about white supremacy, I say this. I'm not talking about, these cartoonish examples of white supremacy of, some white man in a hood, burning a cross on your lawn in 2021, or these white supremacists and white nationalists running through Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting Jews will not replace us. No, here's what I'm talking about. The more sophisticated brand of white supremacy, of people, because of their race, thinking they are the only ones who have the right to think, know, and decide about everything of consequence in this country, whether it's from education, to redistricting, everything in politics, to who gets a doggone Subway or Wendy's franchise. That's what white supremacy is. And so what these people who are in that camp are trying to do, and I think Brother Everett said they don't want to give up power. Power is about forcing some other group to do something that they otherwise would not do. You get to make those decisions, right? And so that's what these people are about. And one scholar said it best, said what people from that group fear, and it is completely racialized, believe me. That group of people, they one, fear political disempowerment. Okay, that's one. Two, many of them fear geographic displacement. Like they don't want their land taken, even though they don't understand history and how they took it from other folk. And on the extremes, when you hear these really uber racist, they fear genetic annihilation. You got these three basic things that is really running these folk. And some of the arguments can get insane, but it is rooted in white supremacy. So the question is, we know what they're doing, right? The question is, how strongly are we going to push back? From Alabama to Georgia to Kentucky to DC to Washington State to California to Maine, because this stuff ain't just located in the South. All right. It is not located in the South. And lastly, I'll say this: as much as people want to say how bad the Republicans are, how increasingly overtly racist they are, they keep winning. Look at the state legislatures across this country and how many of them are dominated by Republicans. Look at the state executive, that being the governors, how many are Republicans. They are still winning. It's looking like they certainly will get closer in the House, may retake the Senate at the midterms. So why do Americans keep voting for this party that is so overtly racist? That's another conversation now, isn't it? So I'll be quiet with that.
Well, let me say this, because the discussion we're having here and why it's so significant, and Brother Daniels here will speak to this, is that it manifests itself in policy. When we make decisions, it becomes the system of the basis, the context, the framework, often fueled by funds or the lack thereof, to implement exactly what that is that may have a disparate impact on someone because of the color of their skin. I introduced Brother Daniels, I Representative Daniels, I introduced a bill called requires a racial impact study on bills that suggests disparate impact, et cetera, just to bring information to the table so that we can examine that and make intelligent decisions instead of running that through. Hadn't been heard yet, but I'm confident that my colleagues will hear that, because I'm confident that not everyone is conscious of the impact they're having on a racial basis. I mean, it's not like somebody's a racist necessarily that's running around participating in this. They're dealing with constructs of power and all other kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the result becomes the same to many people that look like the people on this panel right here. So I'm going to ask a question just a minute, because I want Joe Grant to tell us what NBCSL is doing and what it thinks should be done in terms of the response to this voter suppression and the policies that are adversely affecting people of color, particularly African Americans, in this regard.
Thanks, Senator. I'll say that our members, are on the front line. They're policymakers, so they're in state legislatures, and they've been really carrying a lot of water, trying to stop bad legislation, and when they couldn't, trying to make it more palatable to Black people. We've not been successful in doing that. You all know why. I mean, we don't have votes in most situations. NBCSL has decided that the time for trying to correct some of this at the state level is past. That horse has left the barn, and federal intervention is really the only way that we're going to get all this corrected at one time. So we have gotten engaged now in trying to move forward federal legislation, even though we're having some significant challenges doing that. You all know what has happened to the John Lewis Act and the Freedom to Vote Act on the Senate side. The Senate's inability to get 51 votes to do a carve out for voting rights as they've done for Judicial and Appropriations Act. Um, we've also looked at what's going on with the Electoral Count Act, believing that there may be some vehicle there that we could amend to address some of the voter protection issues. The question is still out on that. But what's important for us is that NBCSL believes that we have to get corporate America more involved in this issue. You know, they really now are the only ones that we believe political leaders at the federal level are going to listen to, because these corporations fund their campaigns. And so our strategy is to get them engaged. Many of them who've already expressed their position. We have a letter circulating of 240 businesses that are supporting rekindling the fight for voting rights. So our campaign over the next couple of months will be focused on calling our people to Washington, really doing a full court press to regenerate some interest on the Senate side, where there's no appetite for taking this on. But that is something that is necessary. We may have to do like the Republicans did on the Affordable Care Act. You know, they called the vote on the Affordable Care Act seems like every 90 days. They lost every vote. But what was important was that the fight continued and the fight was visible. And that was important to their members and ginned up their base to turn out in the election. We may have to try a similar strategy to that to be sure that we gin up our base to turn out in the midterms. Keep your fingers crossed. You know, we believe we're going to be successful, but we're going to need a lot of prayer and a lot of hard work. And Senator, with that, I apologize, but I need to peel off. I've got another webinar that's going to start in about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for participating. Well, thank you very much for joining in. We appreciate your participation.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. Thanks, Senator Neal.
So Anthony Everett, if I can, I'm gonna come back to you, Ricky. I want to know what you see from the ground that needs to be undertaken now. What does the NAACP see? What should we be doing? Or what are you all thinking, at least in Kentucky?
I think that some of what Dr. Joe had just mentioned in terms of working with the corporations and all, and trying to get them to address the politicians and help the politicians focus on doing what's right by their people. I think that's critical, but I'm actually an activist too, you know, so I don't necessarily think that, you know, the corporate world is going to look at it from that standpoint and see it as their best interest. What I do totally agree with him on a moment ago is that it's all about the base. We got to focus on the base, and that base has to be expanded beyond just the African-American community. It has to be in the rural parts of Kentucky. It has to be in a number of different places. A candidate I know running for Senate. I won't say his name because I don't think that's.
Well, keep in mind, this is a non-partisan and non-partisan discussion here. What we're looking at the dynamics as they are. So we don't want to get into any specific.
Right. I'm not going to get into that specific, but I will say that we've got to gin up the base. We've got to focus on reaching people in the rural parts of Kentucky as well as the urban parts of Kentucky, and help them understand that disenfranchisement impacts each and every one of them, that there's electoral injustice that's taking place throughout the state of Kentucky. And so that's what I would say that we really have to focus on. We haven't done that. That's the reason why we have a legislative General Assembly that's predominantly one party over the other party, and that party has no interest in doing what's good for the majority of the people in Kentucky.
Ricky Jones.
Oh yeah, I wasn't raising my hand for a question. I was telling Brother Grant goodbye, but I think Brother Everett makes a very serious point. And as we move region by region, state by state, you know, district by district even, we got to understand some things and make some plans and deal with some realities. I think why Brother Daniels is in a better position right now in Alabama, because you look throughout the South, right, the deep South, historically, it's always had a critical mass of Black people, right? You had a population there. The question was gaining access for that population and coalescing that population around certain socio-political moves. So you get a strong legislator like, Brother Daniels and others throughout Alabama, Mississippi, other areas that can let people know what their potential power is along the lines of race, because this is a racial discussion. If you don't think this is a racial discussion, then you're just being disingenuous. Then something can be done. I believe, to keep this about Kentucky for a moment, but use a political comparative analysis, because as Brother Everett said, he's an activist too. I'm a political scientist by training, right? I think Kentucky is in trouble. And let me tell you why. One place, as much as I love you, Bro Gerald, one thing that you and I have always disagreed on. You're a politician, so you gotta be much more diplomatic than me in a lot of things. But also, we fundamentally disagree on this. You think that there are a lot of white folk in Kentucky, politicians and others, who are doing things that are racially harmful and they don't really understand what they're doing. I have more respect for them than that. I don't think they're ignorant. I think many of them understand exactly what they're doing and they just don't care. That was the problem with Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral suasion, as he was trying to appeal, to people's conscience. He felt if you could just show them how they were harming folks and what they were doing wrong, they'd be like, ooh, I didn't realize that, let me revisit this. And King himself said, what do you do with folk when you show them that what they're doing is wrong and they say, I don't care? That's what Baldwin was talking about when he talked about moral monsters. So when you look at Georgia, for instance, my hometown of Atlanta, Metro Atlanta right now, people talk about, oh, Georgia's this, Georgia that. No, it's Atlanta, okay? Georgia got about 10 million people in it. Metro Atlanta has almost 6 million of those people. So when you talk about voting strength in the state of Georgia, you got almost 60% of that voting strength in Metro Atlanta. So Atlanta is pulling Georgia in a particular direction. Kentucky's most progressive city is Louisville. Louisville is only about a quarter of the state of Kentucky's population, about 4 million people in the state, right at 1 million in Louisville. You don't have the numbers. And relatively speaking, Louisville is not as progressive or as racially diverse as Atlanta. Louisville shot itself in the foot racially 2 decades ago when it voted for merger. When you had a Black voting population of almost 35% that was literally cut in half when you merged the city and county. That's why now you don't even have any serious conversations about having a Black mayor in Kentucky's most progressive city. So in Kentucky, you don't have the numbers. So here's what Black people are starting to do nationwide. And brothers, y'all can tell me if I'm wrong, right? And we're seeing it on a number of levels. As I talked to one of my friends who's an HBCU president, and he said this 5 years ago. He said, you're going to see more and more of our children, because we're seeing it now, coming from affluent Black families who are being recruited by HBCUs and Ivies, very talented students, and they're choosing to go to HBCUs. And I asked, why is that? He says, very simple. People are tired of sending their children to these PWIs to be mistreated. This is what's starting to happen in cities now, too. You're getting more and more very talented, progressive, educated Black people who are choosing to go to places where Black people are, and they feel like they have social opportunities, political opportunities, and they don't have to deal with this stuff every day. So I think Kentucky as a state, Louisville as a city is, unless there's a shift, because there's some people who are very committed to keeping both, white ethno spaces. And you're going to see more and more talented Black people leave, and you're going to see fewer and fewer who are going to come because people aren't interested in being Ruby Bridges. Every now and then, man, people give up. Like Ida B. Wells said in Memphis at the turn of the 20th century. She was like, we need to leave here. And Ida B. Wells Barnett left, and a lot of Black people did. And so I think we're seeing that right now. And so I think people who care about Kentucky, who are Kentucky natives, really worry about the future of it, they really better start having those conversations, because those are educational conversations, social conversations, political conversations, and they all go, into the same vat.
What about, real quick, and I'm going to go to Anthony Daniels, what about the attacks on HBCUs?
HBCUs have always been attacked. I mean, HBCUs are attacked, Black studies departments are attacked, because they disrespect HBCUs, they disrespect Black Studies programs, which is one that I teach in, because they disrespect Black people, right? So people are always going to see us as less than. And so, again, don't allow your enemy to define the terms of discourse. In higher education, when they start talking about elite education and they talking about Harvard and Yale and Princeton or Emory, and I'm like, to hell with that. In the world that I come from, elite schools are Morehouse, Spelman, FAM, Jackson State, Howard, Hampton. It's a different world for me, all right? And it's a different world for a lot of us. So those of us who are HBCU graduates, we understand why HBCUs are attacked. And we also understand why HBCU graduates are some of the most well-armed people to attack back. Like all this stuff going on with anti-CRT in this state, I'm about to sue the state because I think whether these bills in Kentucky pass or not, irreparable harm has already been done to Black Studies departments, programs, and people who teach about race. And so I'm going to sue them, right? Everybody else seems to be scared too. So I'm like, let's do it. Y'all want to play that game? You want to sit around and mess with us? How about some of us mess with you for a change and stop playing nice? Later for that Michelle Obama stuff, when they go low, I go high. No, I'm trying to go lower. If they go for my knees, I'm going for their ankles. And there's some other Black people who are willing to do that too, because we understand what's being done to us. So God bless the brothers who are out here swinging for the fences like Brother Daniels. Man, you're a blessing. You're a blessing, Brother Everett. You too, Brother Neil.
Framed another way, it's a good thing, first of all, that we have the First Amendment and can speak our mind and speak truth to power and not equivocate on it. And say exactly what we're talking about based upon facts and make those arguments and proceed on it. That's one thing that we have. Of course, now there's some people that don't want to hear the unpleasant truth. And there's always that reaction. There's always power pounding on those who put those things on the table that people don't want to hear, even if it is true, even if you make the argument, support it 10 times. So that's part of the problem, as I see it, is that if you are of goodwill, then you will deal with the truth of the matter and then respond in a goodwill fashion. And I see that as part of the problems that Anthony Daniels, have they listened in Alabama? Is there something that I'm missing in the comment I just made or what?
Well, no, I think to go back to the earlier question before Brother Joe got off, I think we lack really playing the long game. If you look at different states across the country, the other side has a think tank in every state. In the legislative side, we don't have a policy think tank that we can go to help train even our municipal, state, or national elected officials. So oftentimes we're playing defense. Case in point, there's no way in the hell I should have been the first African-American minority leader in Alabama state's history. When African-American Democrats were in charge before 2010 for 100 years, okay? But Black folks still were the minority when it came to issues, even when they were in the majority by party.
In their own party.
Second,
Democratic Party.
our people just happy. Yes.
Yes.
Our people, so we're in the same position. That's what I'm basically saying, as Brother Jones mentioned earlier. So for me, a part of the issue is that we got to stop being satisfied with the honorable mention of just saying and attaching to a piece of legislation that you must have minority representation. There is no measurement or no follow-up or accountability even on that. So we got to stop sending hungry boys and hungry girls to get our food in the Alabama legislature and in other offices across the state. So we got to prepare our leaders to understand how to attack systemic racism. Just talking about it is not going to satisfy the problem, which is why our focus has been more on access to capital for minority-owned businesses. It's been for cradle to pre-K programs to help educate our children in a universal way. That's where we're going, because from birth to the age of 5 is 90% of brain development. And research says that every dollar you spend in early childhood has saved you $7 in corrections. So if we know that, why aren't our policies reflective across the country of making certain that we're not sending our child for the first 3 years, our children for the first 3 years to grandma's house when everybody else's child is in an early childhood program. So when they get in kindergarten or get in pre-K, they're not prepared. So for me, we're focusing on the systemic issues that's keeping our community behind, while at the same time playing defense on policies that are designed to further incarcerate our people. And so I think that at some point, defense is good, but we got to start playing more offense and being strategic about it. But if we don't have a source and resources like Brother Jones and Brother Everett helping us and guiding some of the policies, folks that are well-read and well-studied to help us think through it, then we're going to be having the same conversation 10 years from now, 20 years from now, Senator Neal.
Amen, Brother Daniel.
And so in
Amen.
Alabama, we're playing defense, but we're attaching things that are going to help attack the systemic issue that exists within the policies and the infrastructure, even down to our Constitution. We've been attacking our Constitution of removing racist language from our Constitution and redefining some things in our Constitution that's going to be on the ballot in November. But when you have 500,000 African Americans that's registered to vote that don't vote in the state of Alabama, that is a problem. And another 500,000 that's not even registered, that's how you change elections. But we're having conversations around what really is going to drive impact. And it's time for us to start visiting about what's going to provide the impact at the municipal level. Why you should vote in municipal elections, right? Preparing the next generation of judges, because in all of our urban centers, we are, in many instances, are the majority. But we're acting as if we don't care and there's nothing going on when we are being impacted, our children are being impacted each and every day. So we got to get real, and that's something I think the NBCSLs and others could do. We need think tanks and organizations to help provide us with guidance on how to make real impact long term, because we don't have it.
Let me say this, and we're going to leave it right there. But let me say this, that to your last point, NBCSL is instituting a major policy think tank initiative. And I think you're going to be involved in it. I can see that now by your comments. I want to say this. We're talking about voter rights and voter suppression. We took it back historically. We brought it up to 1965. We went past 65 up to today. The struggle continues. That's clear. We're also talking about the fact of the matter is that it's not just that everybody is of bad will and will not join hands with us, but we must lead that fight. We must assert ourselves. I think that message is clear. But I think it's also incumbent upon those of goodwill to step up to the plate. You don't get a pass on this. You know, history defines you as well. It defines what you do and what you don't do. And I think that comes out of this discussion as well. I think, what we're saying here when we commemorate SELMA, when we commemorate those who have actually given their lives for what this country is about, and then to be casually dismissed as Ricky Jones points out, to in effect discount and to diminish the value of human beings and give that the pass for you to ignore and or trample on someone else's realities is just not good for humanity, and it certainly is not good for the United States of America or this democracy. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating. Dr. Joseph M. Grant, Anthony Daniels, Representative Anthony Daniels, the House Minority Floor Leader of Alabama, Dr. Ricky L. Jones, a distinguished scholar and professor of Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville, Dr. Anthony Everett, a great leader in his own right with an organization that needs no introduction. The NAACP, in this case, the Kentucky Conference of NAACP. I want to thank you for this because you're making the case for those who will listen, for those who will hear, for those who know that there's a historic and history calling for us to address these issues, each and every one of them, in the interest of all of us. I want to say to you that I appreciate this particular discussion, and we will continue this into the future. The struggle continues. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.